The Barents Sea was black glass under the pale sun, a frozen void where silence reigned heavier than the ice. 50 nautical miles north of Tromsø, the USS Norfolk, a Virginia-class submarine, drifted beneath the shelf in total radio silence. Her commander, Captain Aaron McCleary, stared at the sonar display as if it were the pulse of the world itself. Above, a storm of diplomatic cables and satellite transmissions hinted at something larger than any one mission. The Arctic, once a frontier of cooperation, was about to become a front line. For months, the United States and its NATO allies had accused Russia of covert militarization of the polar region, new radar arrays on Franz Josef Land, missile silos camouflaged as weather stations, and an expanding fleet of nuclear-powered icebreakers fitted with surface-to-air defenses. Moscow dismissed it all as sovereign infrastructure. Washington called it strategic encirclement. Operation Arctic Shield, authorized by the president only 5 days prior, was meant to reassert NATO's freedom of navigation through the northern route. Officially, it was an escort mission for civilian shipping. Unofficially, it was a test to see how far the Kremlin would go before firing the first shot. From his command seat aboard the USS Norfolk, McCleary reviewed the orders for the 12th time. Shadow the convoy. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Maintain positional ambiguity at all costs. Simple words. But every captain in the Northern Fleet, American or Russian, knew what they meant. The wrong interpretation, the wrong sonar ping, the wrong 20 seconds could ignite the first great war of the 21st century. In Severomorsk, the headquarters of the Russian Northern Fleet, Admiral Viktor Malenkov watched a different screen, a digital map pulsing with red and blue markers across the Arctic. He had spent 30 years under the ice, rising from sonar operator to commander of the fleet. He trusted his instincts more than his computers, and his instincts screamed that the Americans were probing for weakness. He turned to his staff. Confirm again the reports from Franz Josef Station? Yes, Admiral. A drone strike, likely American, destroyed a relay tower near the base perimeter. No casualties. Likely American, Malenkov repeated. Likely is how wars begin. He authorized Operation Severny Cordon, Northern Fence, the quiet mobilization of Russian anti-submarine assets across the Barents. Within hours, the Syeverodvinsk, Yazan-class, and Kazan, improved Yazan-M, submarines were deployed to shadow the American strike group believed to be forming near Svalbard. Surface elements. The Admiral Gorshkov frigate and 2 corvettes moved north under the guise of a training exercise. By the second week of March 2036, the ice cracked under pressure from both sides, politically and literally. The first NATO convoy departed Tromsø, composed of 7 merchant vessels carrying liquefied hydrogen cells, accompanied by the USS Thomas Hudner, Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, and the British HMS Cardiff, along with air cover from the Norwegian Air Force. The route would take them along the edge of the ice shelf toward Novaya Zemlya, a corridor Moscow had declared part of its extended maritime security zone. The West called it illegal territorial overreach. At 3:40 local time, the convoy entered contested waters. Within minutes, radar contacts appeared, small, fast-moving, without transponders. Drones. Dozens of them. Their silhouettes skimmed the surface like angry insects, broadcasting coded bursts in the Russian military band. Looks like they want us to know they're watching, said Lieutenant Ramirez, Norfolk's sonar chief. McCleary nodded. Good. Let's give them a show they won't understand. He ordered the sub to run silent, 200 meters deeper, switching to passive sonar only. On his display, a new contact emerged, faint but distinct. A Russian acoustic profile. Yazan-class. Close. In the NATO Operations Center in Brussels, satellite imagery confirmed both fleets had moved within 40 miles of each other. The defense secretary briefed the president. It's a dance. Sir, they're shadowing each other under the ice. One collision, one sonar misread, and we're in a world war. Then make sure the music stops before someone trips, the president replied. At 4:15, the USS Thomas Hudner picked up an unidentified sonar ping ahead of the convoy. Rules of engagement required positive identification, but the contact was moving fast, closing the distance. The bridge fell silent. Contact bearing 085, range 9,000 yards. Speed 35 knots and rising. Subsurface. Unconfirmed. Could be a decoy. Or, before the officer finished, the radar lit with multiple returns. From the east, a Russian Il-38N maritime patrol aircraft descended to 200 feet, releasing sonar buoys in a long silver line. The destroyer's ECM officer swore under his breath. The Russians were painting the convoy, marking every ship. The message was clear: you are not welcome here. McCleary aboard the Norfolk listened to the sonar feed, the rhythmic ping, 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 like a countdown. Are they targeting us? His XO asked. No, McCleary replied. They're showing restraint. For now. In Moscow, the Kremlin Situation Room buzzed with conflicting reports. The president was briefed that American drones had been detected over the Kara Sea, possibly armed. Simultaneously, the Russian frigate Gorshkov reported electronic interference, jamming from an unknown NATO source. What's their intention? The defense minister asked. To push, Malenkov said simply. To see if we will push back. He was right. At 4:52, just as dawn broke over the horizon, the HMS Cardiff registered a sharp sonar return, metallic, rapid. A torpedo? No, a glider drone. But the ship's automated defense system didn't care. It locked on, fired a decoy flare, and broadcast an emergency burst over encrypted NATO frequencies. That burst, a single coded message, was intercepted by Russian command as incoming fire. Within seconds, Malenkov's staff relayed the alert to all assets in the Barents. Hostile contact detected. Engage defensive posture. Below the ice, Captain McCleary saw it all unfold on sonar. The sudden bloom of noise, the shifting signatures of propellers and countermeasures. Jesus Christ, someone fired off an ECM flare, he muttered. They'll think it's an attack. He tried to raise the surface fleet. No response. The comms were jammed. Aboard the Russian Kazan, Captain Sergei Pankratov received the emergency transmission. Contact reported. Hostile action confirmed. He looked at his weapons officer, then at the glowing sonar trace that corresponded, by chance, to the USS Norfolk. Permission to arm the tubes? Pankratov hesitated. His hands trembled just slightly. Negative, he said. We confirm first. We fire never. But across the sea, aboard the Thomas Hudner, the system had already classified Kazan's acoustic pattern as hostile subsurface combatant, level 1. Captain, target lock established. Belay that, McCleary shouted. Do not fire. The sonar screen pulsed, then flashed white. An underwater detonation, distant but unmistakable. A mine? A malfunction? No one knew. For a few seconds, the Barents Sea became the loudest place on Earth. The explosion didn't sink anyone. Not yet. But it tore through the fragile calm like a knife through thin ice. Both sides believed the other had struck first. At 5:01, the Norwegian frigate Skjold transmitted a single line before losing contact. Engagement protocols triggered. Surface conflict imminent. From Tromsø to Severomorsk, from Washington to Moscow, the world's most powerful militaries braced for a fight none of them truly wanted. And beneath the Arctic sky, the ice began to crack. At 5:14 hours, the Barents Sea erupted into organized confusion. The sonar feeds from NATO's Arctic Shield Task Force filled with static, then silence. What began as a single underwater detonation now spread into a cascade of false contacts and erratic signatures, the sonic ghosts of fear and miscalculation. Aboard the USS Norfolk, Captain McCleary and his crew worked in red-lit tension. The sub's computers flickered from overuse, struggling to filter the chaos of the acoustic battlefield above. The convoy's escorts, the Thomas Hudner, the HMS Cardiff, and the Norwegian Skjold, were broadcasting fragmented distress codes. Something had gone terribly wrong near the surface. Multiple detonations, said Lieutenant Ramirez, voice taut. Source unknown. Could be depth charges, could be countermeasures. But they're spreading east. McCleary rubbed his temples. They're panicking. Someone up there thinks they're being attacked. He knew how quickly defensive actions could spiral. In the Arctic, even echoes could kill. On the other side of the thermal layer, the Russian Yazanim submarine Kazan had gone dark. Captain Sergei Pankratov sat in silence as sonar pings reflected off the hull. Depth? 300 meters, stable. Enemy contact? 2 confirmed. 1 Virginia class, 1 surface group moving northwest. He didn't want to fight, but his orders were clear. If a NATO vessel crossed within 15 nautical miles of the Novaya Zemlya shelf, it would be considered an act of aggression. The Americans were now at 12. His political officer, a young major sent by Moscow only a week earlier, whispered, "Comrade Captain, the situation reports say they struck first. We cannot appear weak." Pankratov didn't answer. He stared at the sonar plot, a glowing ring where the Norfolk signature had last been seen. "War starts when you stop asking if it's a mistake," he said quietly. "And by then, it's already too late." At 5:27, NATO command in Brussels received a garbled transmission. "Convoy hit. Fire aboard. Request air cover." Then silence. Satellite imagery later confirmed that the HMS Cardiff had sustained damage from an underwater explosion off her starboard quarter, cause unknown. To NATO, it looked like a torpedo strike. To Russia, it looked like retaliation. In Severomorsk, Admiral Malenkov slammed his fist against the table. "They've drawn first blood," he said. "Authorize localized counteraction." The defense minister hesitated. "Localized? Limited engagement," Malenkov replied. "Sink one ship, make them back off. We end it there." The order went out under encryption code Polar Night. Within minutes, the Kazan received firing clearance. The Norfolk detected the launch first. 2 faint mechanical impulses followed by the unmistakable harmonic of supercavitating torpedoes. In the water, 2 inbound, bearing 090. Ramirez shouted. "Launch decoys, hard to port, full dive." McCleary barked. The sub lurched violently, plates groaning as ballast tanks hissed. Aboard the surface, the Thomas Hudner's sonar officer heard the same sound, the twin heartbeats of underwater death closing fast. "Evade. Evasive pattern delta," the captain ordered. Too late. 1 torpedo passed wide, exploding harmlessly in a plume of phosphorescent spray. The other struck amidships. The shockwave rolled across the Barents like thunder trapped under glass. Men were thrown across the Hudner's deck as alarms screamed. Fires erupted near the hangar bay. The destroyer listed 5 degrees starboard, bleeding fuel into the freezing black water. From the Norfolk's depth, McCleary felt the concussion through the hull. He closed his eyes. "God damn it," he muttered. "They hit us." News traveled faster than reason. In Washington, the Pentagon's Arctic Command reported the incident as an unprovoked Russian attack. In Moscow, the Kremlin received confirmation that a NATO destroyer had fired countersalvos. Both reports were wrong. Both were believed. By 6 o'clock, the air war began. A pair of American F-35CS launched from the carrier USS Gerald R. Ford operating in the Norwegian Sea. Their mission, provide cover for the retreating convoy. But before they reached the Barents, Russian radar from Murmansk tracked them and responded. Within minutes, MiG-35 scrambled from Alenia Air Base. The skies above the ice turned into a chessboard of invisible moves. Down below, the sea roared again. The Kazan, now hunted, fired countermeasures and turned west. The Norfolk pursued, not to attack, but to confirm. McCleary's XO protested, "Sir, we can't chase them. If they think we're closing for kill range." "I know what they'll think," McCleary snapped. "But if we let them slip, they'll hit the convoy again." At 6:22, the Norfolk crossed the invisible threshold, Russia's claimed maritime border. The sonar screen bloomed with pings. They were surrounded. In orbit, American and Russian reconnaissance satellites watched the same scene unfold in real time, each side misinterpreting the other's movements. At NORAD command, a general muttered, "We're watching World War III in 4K. His Russian counterpart, in an underground bunker near Arkhangelsk, said almost the same words. "They are making history in real time, and none of them know it." The final act came swiftly. At 6:41, the Kazan, believing it was under attack, launched its second salvo, 4 torpedoes in a wide spread. The Norfolk detected 3. The 4th ran silent, under the thermal layer, undetected until the last second. "Brace!" Ramirez yelled. The impact came like the hand of God. The blast tore through the Norfolk's aft section, rupturing the reactor coolant line. Lights went out. Pressure alarms shrieked. For 30 seconds, the crew fought to contain the flooding, sealing compartments as icy water rushed in. Then came the order no submariner ever wanted to give. Surface. Emergency blow. The submarine broke through the ice like a dying whale, venting steam and smoke. Crewmen scrambled onto the hull, coughing, eyes wide from the shock of daylight and frost. They fired flares, hoping someone, anyone, would see. 30 miles away, a Russian reconnaissance drone captured the image, a crippled U.S. submarine bleeding fire into the Arctic dawn. Within hours, the photograph circled the globe. At 7:10, both governments announced retaliatory readiness. Strategic bombers were scrambled on both sides. The world held its breath. But under that same gray sky, on a splintering sheet of ice, Captain McCleary stood atop the wreck of his command, watching his men huddle together for warmth. He raised the emergency radio, praying it still worked. "This is the United States submarine Norfolk," he said into the static. "We are not attacking. We are survivors." There was no reply. Only the wind and the distant echo of engines answered him. By midday, the Barents was silent again. The convoy scattered. The Hudner was burning, the Norfolk crippled, and the Kazan limping home under escort. In total, over 80 sailors from both sides were dead or missing. No one could say who fired first. What was certain was far worse. The Arctic had drawn first blood of the next World War. When the sun rose over the Barents, the sea looked calm again. The ice drifted as if nothing had happened. But beneath that stillness lay the wrecks, the oil slicks, and the bodies of sailors who had died for a misunderstanding. The Arctic didn't care who fired first. It simply swallowed them all. At 9 o'clock hours GMT, emergency channels across the North Atlantic erupted. The USS Norfolk had lost main power. Its surviving crew clung to the frozen hull, surrounded by debris. The destroyer Thomas Hudner was still afloat but badly damaged, fires raging across its deck. NATO command declared a full maritime rescue operation, Operation White Halo. Yet in Moscow, the same transmissions sounded like something else, a cover story for reinforcements. The Kremlin interpreted the NATO rescue flotilla as a prelude to invasion. Within minutes, Russian Northern Fleet headquarters raised alert level Vostok Red. Strategic bombers from Engels Air Base were placed on standby. Submarines began repositioning toward the Giuk Gap, the narrow gateway between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, the line that had once defined Cold War geography and was now being redrawn. In Washington, the Situation Room was a war of voices. "Sir, we've confirmed casualties. The Norfolk's reactor is stable but leaking coolant. Rescue them, but keep the Russians off," the president said. "With respect, Mr. President," the chairman of the Joint Chiefs interrupted, "the Russians see that as an act of aggression. Their satellite imagery shows our carrier group moving north. That's a humanitarian operation," the Secretary of Defense argued. "Tell them that," the admiral muttered, "when their radar screens fill with F divided by a -18s. Outside the Oval Office, the press already had its own version. Russian aggression in Arctic, NATO strikes back. Within an hour, Moscow's headline was the mirror image. Americans attack our defenders, Russia responds. Truth was no longer relevant. Only momentum mattered. At 11:40, the Russian icebreaker Severny, 12, converted for rescue, reached the Norfolk's position. Through binoculars, the American survivors saw the black hull emerge from the mist, bearing the white and blue naval flag. Captain McCleary hesitated. The rules of engagement were clear: no unauthorized contact with foreign vessels. But his men were freezing to death on the ice. "Send a light signal," he ordered. "Request medical aid. No weapons." The Russians blinked back a reply. "We will help. No war here." They sent inflatable boats across the slush. The Americans climbed in without a word. No cameras, no press, no command chains, just sailors saving sailors. For 30 minutes, humanity overruled politics. Then, predictably, politics came back. At 12:15, a NATO surveillance drone captured footage of the rescue and transmitted it to Brussels. The image, Russian flags over U.S. sailors, went viral within minutes. Commentators called it propaganda. Senators called it surrender. Moscow called it proof that it had shown mercy. By the time McCleary reached the Russian ship's infirmary, the world had already turned him into a symbol of weakness to some, of decency to others. Meanwhile, deep in the Kremlin, Admiral Malenkov faced his own storm. The defense minister's voice was brittle. "You were authorized a limited engagement, Victor. Limited. And now half the Arctic fleet is mobilized. Malenkov leaned on the table. We struck one destroyer. They responded with aircraft carriers and global outrage. You can't calibrate chaos. The president entered silently, carrying a folder marked confidential, strategic options. Gentlemen, he said, the Americans are deploying more ships to the Norwegian Sea. If we stand down, they will claim victory. If we escalate, we risk annihilation. He paused. So we must choose which humiliation we can survive. At 1300 hours Greenwich Mean Time, the UN Security Council convened an emergency session. The ambassadors of both nations read statements drafted by their military staff. Each blamed the other. Each demanded accountability. Neither used the word war, yet every sentence was one step closer to it. In the middle of the speeches, the Norwegian delegate interrupted with breaking news. We have confirmation that both nuclear command networks, the US Stratcom and the Russian GOU, have switched to elevated readiness. The room fell silent. No one wanted to say it aloud, but everyone knew what that meant. The codes were being armed. By late afternoon, Arctic weather closed in, grounding most aircraft. The sea became a maze of fog and drifting icebergs. The American carrier USS Gerald R. Ford pulled back south for safety. The Russian frigate Admiral Gorshkov remained on station, its crew exhausted but alert. For the first time in 20 hours, there were no explosions, no sonar contacts, no radio threats. Just silence, the kind that feels like the pause before a scream. Aboard the Severny, 12, Captain McCleary regained consciousness in a small infirmary. His wounds were minor, but his pride was gone. A Russian medic handed him a cup of hot tea. You fought well, the man said in broken English. McCleary looked at him. We weren't supposed to fight at all. The medic shrugged. No one ever is. That night, both superpowers stood at the threshold. In Alaska, B-2 bombers were armed. In Murmansk, mobile missile batteries rolled toward the coast. The world's digital networks hummed with cyber probes and countermeasures. Even GPS systems flickered intermittently, victims of jamming warfare that no one officially admitted. Then, at 22:03 Greenwich Mean Time, an encrypted transmission was received simultaneously in Washington and Moscow, a joint distress call from the Severny, 12. This is Captain Viktor Chernov. We carry survivors from USS Norfolk. Reactor leakage worsening. Need assistance from both sides. Repeat, both sides. The message was routed through every military and diplomatic channel. It reached the U.S. president as he stood in the underground command center, surrounded by advisors demanding retaliation orders. Sir, said the communications officer, they're asking for joint rescue authorization. Russian and American personnel aboard the same ship. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Finally, the president said, patch it through to Moscow. Tell them, we'll come. In Severomorsk, Admiral Malenkov heard the same words through static. We'll come. He smiled faintly, the first time in days. Then maybe we aren't doomed yet. At 2 o'clock local time, under the green shimmer of the aurora, a U.S. helicopter and a Russian one descended side by side onto the drifting ice near the Severny, 12. Their rotor blades chopped the same frozen air. Crews moved quickly, transferring the wounded, sealing the reactor bay, stabilizing the crippled ship. No one saluted. No one shouted orders. It was work born of desperation, not alliance. Photographs from that night, American and Russian rescue crews kneeling together under the northern lights, would later be called the night of common sense. For a brief flicker of time, sanity prevailed. The crisis did not end that night, but it changed shape. By dawn, both sides agreed to a temporary ceasefire zone across the Barents. A joint commission began investigating the incident, though everyone knew it had been a series of human errors stacked like dominoes. The Norfolk survivors were repatriated via Norway. McCleary returned to a nation that hailed him as a hero and blamed him as a coward, often in the same headline. In Russia, Captain Pankratov of the Kazan was quietly reassigned. Officially, he had acted with discipline and courage. Unofficially, he was told to disappear from public life. His last recorded words in his logbook were simple: "The ocean does not forgive pride." Months later, when the ice thawed enough for divers to return, they found the wreck of the Thomas Hudner half buried in silt. Inside, a crewman's body was still strapped to his station, hand frozen to the radio mic. The final entry in the ship's log read, holding position, still trying to de-escalate. The irony was unbearable. In the years that followed, the Barents Incident became a turning point. The Arctic was militarized beyond recognition. New treaties were written, old alliances strained. No formal war was declared, but no peace followed either. Analysts would later describe it as the silent beginning of the Fourth World Conflict, fought not with declarations, but with drones, denials, and data. And yet, somewhere in that frozen void where the Norfolk had sunk and the Severny, 12 had drifted, the ice still closed each spring, hiding the scars. The satellite saw nothing but endless white. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, retired Captain Aaron McCleary visited Tromsø under heavy snow. He stood by the harbor, watching cargo ships trace the same route that had once sparked the war that almost was. Reporters asked him what he remembered most. He thought for a long time, then said, "The silence. How the sea went quiet right before it all began, and again when it ended. Maybe that's what peace really sounds like, not applause, not victory. Just the ocean deciding it's had enough of us." The world moved on, but the Arctic remembered. Beneath the aurora and the drifting ice, wrecks rested side by side. American steel and Russian steel, rusting into the same indifferent sea. And somewhere in the static of abandoned communication buoys, a single automated signal still echoed every midnight, looping endlessly across the polar dark. "This is the USS Norfolk. We are survivors.